Application layer security for email and web browsers. The espionage incidents Mandiant investigated in 2013 all began with an email message, or several, sent to employees at the target organizations. It's the same way that the SCDOR breach began, and the CryptoLocker ransomware spread to new victims. Thanks to its ubiquity and flexibility, email figures in a variety of security incidents spanning different classes of harm, from espionage to financial fraud. And because anyone can send an email to anyone else, it is often used in early stages of these incidents, since it requires no prior capabilities or access. For malicious actors who have not managed to illicitly procure credentials, email offers opportunities to do just that, as well as to encourage recipients to initiate financial transfers or download malware. Many of the security challenges associated with email stem from the fact that, as an application, email was designed to allow anyone to send messages from any from address, regardless of whether they possess credentials for that address or its domain. This makes impersonation and, by extension, phishing very easy to accomplish in the context of email. While several solutions have been proposed over the years, many of them involving some version of digital signatures to verify that emails were actually sent from the person they claim to be from, few have caught on with any significant number of email users. In 2008, PayPal became concerned about the large volumes of phishing emails being sent to its users, so its owner eBay made an agreement with Yahoo and Google that it would send only digitally signed emails, and the two email providers in turn agreed to discard any messages sent from the PayPal or eBay domain that were not signed or had invalid signatures. In a blog post announcing the agreement, Gmail spam czar Brad Taylor wrote, "Now any email that claims to come from PayPal.com or eBay.com and their international versions is authenticated by Gmail and, here comes the important part, rejected if it fails to verify as actually coming from PayPal or eBay." That's right. You won't even see the phishing message in your spam folder. Gmail just won't accept it at all. Conversely, if you get a message in Gmail where the from says at PayPal.com or at eBay.com, then you'll know it actually comes from PayPal or eBay. It's email the way it should be. This notion of email the way it should be hints at the crucial challenge of trying to delineate malicious and legitimate application-specific behaviors, or defining the shoulds and should-nots of email use. Users should be able to receive emails from PayPal, but should not receive such emails from senders who don't have any affiliation with the company. They should be able to open links and attachments they want to view, but should not be able to open ones designed to steal their credentials or encrypt their files. They should be able to correspond with strangers and receive bulk emails, but should not be able to correspond with users who are known to be malicious or receive their bulk emails. These restrictions are implemented through technical tools, but fundamentally they are social decisions about what sorts of communications should be permitted online between people who may not know each other. Email defenses correspond to a range of these restrictions, not just those designed to combat impersonation. These include blacklists of known spammer IP addresses, domains, and open proxies, like those maintained by Spamhaus, visual indicators of attachment file types, of the sort manipulated by the PLA espionage efforts, in which executable files were disguised as PDFs, or filters that reject emails on the basis of particularly suspicious text or content. None of the potentially malicious behaviors that these techniques are designed to defend against, impersonation, sending email through open proxies, sending executable attachments, are inherently malicious. All of them may serve useful and legitimate purposes in certain circumstances, making it that much harder to draw clear-cut distinctions between what users should and shouldn't be able to do, and what types of behavior should and shouldn't be flagged as suspicious. This ambiguity and overlap between legitimate and malicious uses of applications makes it possible for intruders to disguise their initial access attempts via email or other applications as legitimate. It also means that the most effective and feasible means of defense through application design is often not banning certain capabilities outright, for example, preventing all users from sending email attachments, but instead increasing how much work attackers must do to execute these capabilities by honing in on the subtle discrepancies between potentially malicious and legitimate activity. Web browsers, like email, often facilitate interactions between users and unknown actors who own and operate websites. Also, like email, these capabilities are often used to impersonate trusted actors, obtain credentials or financial information, and install malicious programs, but are not necessarily tied to a particular class of harm. In the case of both applications, the potential for maliciousness increases with capabilities that allow for impersonation, downloads, and requests to users to input or provide information. Existing browser security mechanisms address certain components of these capabilities, for instance, by notifying users when they connect to sites with invalid certificates, blocking sites with known malicious certificates, or blocking JavaScript. But the variety of different ways malicious actors can use these capabilities, individually and in combination, to achieve the same goals, such as stealing credentials or sending outbound traffic from targeted machines, makes it difficult to pinpoint any single capability that is common to all malicious uses of browsers. The relationship between email and web browsers is particularly messy, since email is often used to send links to websites, while browsers are increasingly used to access email. The interplay between the two applications adds to the challenges of defending them individually. In the SCDOR breach, for instance, a phishing email was used to access credentials that could then be used to log in to the department's servers remotely through a separate remote access application. From a defensive standpoint, the number of steps and different applications involved in such a compromise can be both advantageous in that it offers lots of opportunities for intervention, and also problematic in that it complicates the question of who or which application is responsible for identifying and preventing which components of the intrusion. Two defensive strategies follow from this dilemma. One is to limit the allowed interaction between different applications, the extent to which capabilities in one can be used in the context of another. For instance, by restricting the circumstances under which links to websites can be sent via email. This sandboxing approach narrows the broader range of malicious capabilities presented by other applications that a designer must worry about. An alternative is for application designers and operators to actively broaden their scope by creating their own versions of multiple related applications and using their increased control of and visibility into the interaction among those applications to reinforce security mechanisms across all of them. For example, the fraudulent certificates stolen in the DigiNotar breach and used to access Gmail accounts were largely ineffective for users who used both Google's email service and its browser, because the approved credentials for the company's email site had been pinned to its browser. Had both of those applications not been operated by the same entity, it would have been much more difficult to identify the use of fraudulent certificates. On the other hand, Google's approach also introduces a new means of compromising the company's websites by going after the pinned certificate information in their Chrome browser rather than forging certificates, as the DigiNotar intruder did. Thinking through security design for web browsers and email requires defining certain very narrow parameters under which people and organizations with no pre-existing relationships should interact via computer systems, and excluding any forms of interaction that have clear potential to be harmful or serve malicious ends. From a defensive perspective, this means making malicious actors work harder to be able to achieve those forms of interaction. That work can come from many different types of restrictions, ranging from only restricting the capabilities of known malicious actors by blacklisting their IP addresses, certificates, or other specific identity indicators, to restricting the capabilities of all unknown actors, for instance, by blocking JavaScript or attachments by default for all websites or emails. However, all of these defenses have limitations, especially when it comes to fending off adversaries with considerable resources. For example, blacklists would probably have done little to hinder PLA Unit 61398, which, according to Mandiant's report, was using at least 13 X.509 encryption certificates, 40 families of malware, and more than 3,000 domain names, IP addresses, and hashes of malware. Blacklists may help defenders identify reuse of those resources, but the volume of indicators also suggests how easily the PLA can afford to replace them with new ones. There are also several ways email services and web browsers can and do signal users about the possibility of impersonation, providing icons, warning messages, and other indications of suspicious activity within a browser or email client. Often, however, these signals go unnoticed or unheeded by users. These are all essentially technical controls, but crucially, they are technical controls designed to provide a defensive function that organizations and users often cannot take on themselves. While organizations can maintain credentials for their employees and monitor what goes on inside their own networks, they may have much less visibility into the origins of incoming email messages or websites. Organizations can set restrictions about what sites their employees are able to visit or what types of attachments they can open. But ultimately, they rely heavily on application designers to help them figure out which indicators to use in distinguishing between legitimate and malicious activity when they encounter an email message or a website that could have been authored by anyone. Limiting what intruders can do without credentials through email and web browsers places greater pressure on those intruders to acquire trusted credentials. Once an intruder has acquired credentials, distinguishing between malicious and legitimate use of those capabilities becomes much trickier because the credentials themselves typically serve as the crucial indicator of legitimacy. Monitoring anomalous user behavior. Efforts aimed at distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate credentialed users are largely predicated on the idea that much application use is habitual, that users routinely go to the same sites, communicate with the same people, and in fairly regular volumes, transfer money to the same places, and in fairly regular volumes, use the same devices and IP addresses, and deviations from those habits may therefore serve as indicators of malicious activity. Such defenses are most effective for applications that encourage standard use patterns, and the role of application designers lies in understanding what particular regular routines users are likely to develop in the context of their applications that might be difficult for attackers to replicate. Often these fall into the categories of volume-based habits, for example, numbers of emails sent per day. Interaction identity-based habits, for example, popular contacts or frequently visited websites. User identity-based habits, for example, typing speed or eye movement patterns, or hardware and network-based habits, for example, MAC addresses or IP addresses. But there are not always clear changes in users' behavior after their credentials are compromised. For instance, a group of researchers at Google analyzed the behavior of manual hijackings of Google accounts using stolen credentials and found that these incidents are difficult to defend against in part because what manual hijackers do when interacting with Google's services is not very different from what normal users do. Normal users also search their inboxes and read emails, set up email filters, and change their password and their recovery options. In other words, in this context, malicious activity looks too much like legitimate activity to be reliably identified or defended against. The researchers' analysis also suggests a slightly different approach to identifying malicious use of authenticated capabilities, looking for identifiable habits of attackers rather than legitimate users. For instance, the Google analysis found that account hijackers were likely to search for certain terms in their victim's email, for example, wire transfer, bank, investment, password, username, connect from IP addresses in certain countries, China, Ivory Coast, Malaysia, Nigeria, and South Africa, and send messages to, on average, 630% more recipients per day than the legitimate users of those accounts. On the other hand, the researchers also describe active efforts on the part of the hijackers to blend in with legitimate activity, noting particularly that, on average, the hijackers attempted to access only 9.6 distinct accounts from each IP, which makes their activity extremely difficult to distinguish from organic traffic. The number of outgoing emails from hijacked accounts was also only 25% higher on average than the number of legitimate messages sent from the account the day before the hijacking, though each message was typically sent to many more recipients, accounting for the 630% increase in distinct recipients. This suggests the extent to which perpetrators' motives dictate the constraints of their intrusion and the elements of their malicious activity that may be more or less easily disguised. IP addresses, for instance, can be easily altered to avoid suspicion, as can the volume of outbound emails, but hijackers must still reach a large number of recipients for attempted email-based phishing or financial scams to be successful. Attempts like these, by hijackers, to disguise their activity to more closely resemble that of legitimate users makes sense in the context of a defensive strategy that is dependent on distinguishing between malicious and legitimate behavior. This is part of what makes the role of application designers so important in thinking about defense. They have significant control over how effectively intruders will be able to disguise their actions to resemble legitimate ones. Additionally, they play an important role in flagging suspicious behavior for legitimate users, especially after credentials are stolen. While intruders use email or websites primarily to catch victims' attention in some fashion or deliver malware, once they've successfully stolen credentials, their behavior often shifts to emphasize greater discretion, and they put more effort into covering their tracks so as to prolong the value of the stolen credentials. This makes signaling a more valuable form of defense through mechanisms such as highlighting when those credentials were used and from what IP address, what they were used for, and whether they are being used simultaneously in multiple instances. Signaling users about potential malicious activity shifts some of the burden of distinguishing between malicious and legitimate activity onto users and system operators, relieving application designers of the need to be able to characterize maliciousness and legitimacy in general terms that apply to everyone. Users and organizations may not always welcome that burden, but by putting the appropriate tools in place to provide these signals, application designers can help guide other stakeholders' thinking about what they should be monitoring and which indicators will be most relevant for them. By setting these parameters for legitimate behavior and offering these signals to users, application designers can manifest, through the technical architecture of their applications, a set of deeply important decisions about what defenders should be on the lookout for and how they should think about what malicious activity might look like in the context of their own systems. Beyond catching bugs and vulnerabilities in their code, the security goals of an application designer ultimately fall into three primary categories. First, to send such clear, prominent, and understandable signals to users about suspicious activity in the context of their applications that the users themselves can be held accountable for ignoring or failing to notice those signals. Second, to draw sharp enough distinctions between legitimate and potentially malicious uses of their applications that intruders have to expend significant effort to engage in the latter, and cannot do so without triggering notice from monitoring users or organizations. And finally, to put in place restrictions that might limit any intruder's ability to leverage a compromise of the application to cause harm. For instance, by encrypting stored information or regularly deleting data. Each of these goals presents significant challenges in the context of applications in which legitimate activity is not easily distinguishable from malicious uses. Still, the crucial advantage of embedding these defenses at the application layer, through decisions made by application designers, is that it allows for these distinctions to be tailored to specific applications and their particular uses, rather than trying to make them across the board for an entire computer system, as organizations are often forced to do. 12. Reasonable security, the role of organizations in protecting their data and networks. While application designers play an important role in shaping how easily malicious actors can acquire different access capabilities, security incidents are most often closely associated with and blamed on the individual institutions whose systems are breached, rather than the particular applications through which their adversaries gained access. This notion that organizations that store data are responsible for its protection is a natural extension of private law liability principles, in which the owner of property is seen as the locus of control. The assumption implicit in the ways these incidents are most often discussed and labeled, the TJX breach, the Sony leaks, the OPM breach, is that the organization that operated the compromised machines and owned the stolen data failed in its responsibilities to protect those assets. Critics and litigants point to the failures. TJX could have provided stronger encryption for its wireless networks. The South Carolina Department of Revenue could have used two-factor authentication. DigiNotar could have segmented its network more effectively. Sony could have noticed the massive quantities of data leaving its network. OPM could have encrypted its personnel files. These are all valid criticisms, and the fact that other stakeholders, including application designers and policymakers, had the ability to defend against certain elements of these incidents does not absolve the targeted organizations from taking steps to protect their computer systems and data. It can be difficult, though, to define their responsibility in concrete terms. After a breach occurs, it's common to point out exactly where organizations went wrong with their security. Members of Congress took OPM administrators to task for failing to use encryption. State legislators in South Carolina criticized the Department of Revenue for failing to use multi-factor authentication. And the credit card companies crucified TJX for using outdated encryption on its wireless network. But these criticisms, offered in hindsight, often do not grapple with the question of whether these missing controls would in fact have been likely to prevent the breach altogether, or would instead have posed a mere inconvenience that the perpetrators could have circumvented relatively easily. This is the crucial question for defending computer systems. Which security controls create the greatest obstacle for intruders by restricting the stages of an attack that cannot be easily replaced or rerouted through another attack vector? Stronger wireless encryption would be of relatively little value to TJX if the credentials that Gonzalez and his co-conspirators wanted to steal could have been acquired just as easily through phishing or dictionary attacks. Similarly, encrypting the OPM files would have served little purpose if the intruders who stole them also had access to the decryption keys or credentials needed to view the information in plain text. It is not enough just to list the security controls that an organization might have had in place when considering its culpability. It is also essential to evaluate how effective those controls would have been at preventing the breach in question, and whether the breached entity could reasonably have been expected to select and implement them out of the sea of available security mechanisms. While there is no shortage of available security products, services, and standards documents to purchase or consult, the sheer quantity of tools and recommendations can itself be an obstacle to organizations trying to figure out how they should spend a limited security budget. For instance, the catalog of security and privacy controls for federal information systems and organizations, provided in the National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-853, and often referenced by private companies as well as government agencies, is more than 400 pages long and lists nearly 300 different security controls. That excess of security advice and services, coupled with a lack of reliable empirical data on which controls and techniques are most effective at preventing intrusions, leads to a security environment in which companies are expected to adhere to an amorphous set of best practices that are almost never explicitly codified until after a breach occurs. Then, in the aftermath of breaches of customer data in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission is often responsible for determining whether a company provided reasonable protections for that data. In the case of the 2013 breach of the retailer Target, for instance, the FTC did not file a complaint, deeming the company to have taken adequate steps to protect its customers' data, even though it was ultimately breached. By contrast, TJX and Ashley Madison both faced FTC complaints for failing to meet their data protection responsibilities. And yet, as the FTC complaints themselves illustrate, it is not entirely straightforward to articulate what precisely those responsibilities are, or how a company can be certain it has fulfilled them. Indeed, the FTC deliberately does not define what exactly constitutes a reasonable set of security measures for a company. Instead, private coalitions such as the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council, set standards for certain industry sectors, and the FTC points to an assortment of these various guidelines and standards documents, including NIST Special Publication 800 to 853, thereby sidestepping the question of which specific measures companies must have in place in order to avoid punitive action from the government. The FTC has good reasons for not defining a clear set of baseline security requirements for companies. The crucial security measures may depend on an organization's particular function, as well as its infrastructure and data assets. Furthermore, the recommended set of controls changes over time as threats evolve, presenting a challenge for keeping such a list up to date. But the vague nature of the security guidance and recommendations given by the government adds to the uncertainty that institutions face when forced to make concrete decisions about how to define the scope of their responsibility for protecting computer systems and what tools to use for that purpose. Headlines and news stories about breaches like TJX, the South Carolina Department of Revenue, DigiNotar, OPM, and Sony serve as cautionary tales for other companies and agencies hoping to avoid a similar fate. But the broader messages of these incidents are mixed for outside observers when it comes to figuring out just how much more seriously they should be taking their computer security, and what, in concrete terms, it even means to take computer security seriously. With the exception of DigiNotar, none of the companies ended up going out of business because they failed to protect their computer systems. This suggests that a large-scale breach may be the kind of problem money can solve. On the other hand, many of those organizations saw directors and chief executives felled by the ensuing controversies and reckoning, indicating that even if a firm is likely to weather the storm, its senior leadership might not be so lucky. All of which points to the obvious but relatively unhelpful conclusion that an organization should take seriously the question of how best to defend its networks, but spend no more on security than they would have to spend to recover from a major breach. And what should they spend that security budget on? Here, history is again a somewhat inconsistent guide for organizations trying to learn from their less fortunate or capable peers. The immediate technical moral of the TJX breach would seem to be to invest in stronger encryption for wireless networks. The South Carolina Department of Revenue incident points to the importance of multi-factor authentication and encryption of stored data. The CryptoLocker ransomware model suggests sandboxing foreign programs so they can't immediately interact with the rest of a computer's contents. The DigiNotar compromise implicates overly complicated firewall rules and regular software updates. The PLA Unit 61398 espionage efforts would seem to recommend stronger email filters and more phishing training. The OPM breach would suggest more malware detection. The Spamhaus denial of service attacks point to the need for a greater reliance on third parties who can absorb and filter malicious traffic, and an end to open DNS resolvers. The Sony breach suggests the need for better network segmentation and tighter restrictions on outbound data. And the Ashley Madison breach points to the need for stronger encryption and regular data deletion. None of these are necessarily bad technical micro-lessons for other organizations to draw from these stories, but neither do they clearly provide a coherent set of measures that add up to a reasonable amount of security for companies. Part of the challenge for organizations safeguarding computer systems and data is that the technical measures available to them are often significantly constrained and influenced by the security decisions made by other stakeholders, including both the design decisions of application developers and the policy decisions made by governments. The initial stages of many of these breaches are typically governed by access through websites and emails, granting an early foothold to outsiders that can then be used to procure credentials or other sensitive information. The design of those applications is largely out of the hands of the organizations using them, though they can sometimes take steps to tailor their use within the confines of their own network. At the same time, mitigating the final stages of these incidents, after the perpetrators have successfully procured an organization's data or compromised its networks, and are trying to use that access to profit financially or conduct espionage or publicly humiliate their victims, is also largely beyond the control of the breached organization. At that point, it is often up to policymakers and law enforcement officials to decide on any retaliatory measures or impose restrictions on how the perpetrators will be able to exploit their illicitly gained information or access. So, organizations protecting their systems and data occupy an in-between set of defensive functions, targeted primarily at the intermediate stages of computer security incidents. Their system administrators have less control over the distinctions between legitimate and malicious activity baked into the applications they use than do developers, and less ability to trace and regulate illicit money flows than government agencies. But they do have important defensive roles that center on restricting credential theft and outbound information flows, covering some of the holes left by other groups' defensive capabilities. Tailoring application capabilities. Companies and government agencies often use software applications they did not design themselves, making them reliant on the decisions of application designers, but they do control some decisions about how to monitor and implement those applications. Just because an organization decides to use email, as indeed most do, does not mean it has no control over how exactly it will filter and safeguard against threats like phishing. The defensive roles of application designers are focused on making it easier to distinguish between legitimate and malicious activity in the context of their applications, but they can also allow some leeway to users and organizations to tailor those distinctions to their own particular circumstances and threat models. For instance, an organization might decide to add a special warning label to any emails sent from outside domains so that employees are not fooled into believing such messages were sent by colleagues. Alternatively, organizations could restrict email attachments to permit only certain types of files, or files that had been cleared by administrators, or files that had first been tested for any malicious behavior in a quarantined computing environment. Similarly, an organization can restrict which websites people on its network can visit, or how easily they can download programs and files from online. These sorts of restrictions are not feasible or sensible for every organization. Their different decisions depend on what they do and what their employees and customers need to be able to do in the course of their normal business. More generally, the distinction between legitimate and malicious capabilities varies according to context. For instance, some organizations may require regular communication with outside unknown entities, while others may view that capability as a threat and wish to instead limit communication to authenticated users within their own network. Similarly, other types of online activity may be viewed as more or less suspicious, depending on the setting. For instance, periods of unusually high-volume email may be routine at places that send large-scale legitimate mailings, and new and unknown devices or IP addresses may not trigger any strong suspicion for organizations whose employees travel frequently, or who provide network access to a large number of visiting guests. Just as application designers can tailor these distinctions to the particular function of their application, so too can organizations further tailor them to suit their particular circumstances and preferences. Part of defending against abuse of online applications as an organization involves building on the analysis of potentially malicious and legitimate capabilities done by application designers. An organization with a clear sense of what kind of activity it expects to witness from legitimate employees and users can ideally refine the distinctions and indicators decided on by application designers and determine the extent to which they actually mirror the organization's own particular threat model and mission. Where there is a mismatch between the types of malicious capabilities and signals selected by application designers, organizations may either choose not to implement a given application or tailor it to their needs, depending on the extent to which designers have made it customizable. These customizations may apply at either the individual or institutional level. For instance, many browsers allow users to choose whether or not to enable JavaScript or manage the default list of trusted SSL certificates. Application designers may find it useful to allow users and organizations to define some of the distinctions between legitimate and malicious activity for themselves. However, enabling this kind of flexibility can give rise to additional risks by creating pathways for adversaries to enable malicious capabilities or remove useful signals under the guise of tailoring an application to fit legitimate needs. If it's possible for someone with the right credentials to alter or remove safeguards and alerts, then intruders may take advantage of those capabilities. This tension between allowing users to define their own security parameters and enabling intruders to change those parameters or remove defensive signals is a tricky one for application designers and organizations. It suggests there may be some advantages to a one-size-fits-all, unalterable approach to security, even though every application and every organization is different and faces slightly different threats, if only because it removes an intruder's ability to alter that approach for nefarious purposes. Many defenses pose questions about how organizations wish to interact with outsiders or people without trusted credentials. Sony Pictures knew it needed to be able to send and receive large video files, for instance, but it's less clear why that would have needed to be the case for the South Carolina Department of Revenue, or OPM. Did you note our needed a public-facing website that outside potential customers could view? But did Marshall's stores need a wireless network that outside devices could connect to? The desired level of interaction with the outside world helps dictate which applications a company or government agency should use, as well as customization of those applications' security settings. This essentially means assessing what capabilities an organization is comfortable granting to people whom it has never encountered in person, or subjected to personnel screening or training procedures. Many, if not most organizations, would probably choose to severely restrict the circumstances under which these interactions with unknown users may take place. But the precise nature of those restrictions may vary, depending on whether an organization's mission is to produce movies, audit tax returns, store personnel files, issue digital certificates, or facilitate extramarital affairs. Organizations, like application designers, also play a vital role in defending user credentials from theft and misuse. Tailoring application restrictions and protecting authentication credentials are intended, respectively, to restrict any potentially malicious capabilities to credentialed users and to restrict any access to trusted credentials to only that group of users or employees. This central defensive ambition is dictated primarily by what institutional actors can control. Application designers can dictate what capabilities are afforded by the applications they design under what conditions, so their defensive function centers on distinguishing between malicious and legitimate capabilities. Organizations have greater control over physical security, including access to machines on protected premises, personnel screening, and credential issuing procedures. Therefore, their defensive role centers on using that to reinforce computer security by trying to force adversaries to tackle physical security measures, by stealing employees' phones or physical devices, for instance, and personnel screening processes in order to achieve desired computer capabilities. Multi-factor authentication and encryption. The crucial ex-ante defensive role of organizations lies in protecting the authentication credentials that restrict who can access potentially malicious capabilities. For organizations that link credentials to users' real identities, for example, employers, governments, schools, this includes ensuring that credentials are issued to the correct people. And for all organizations, it means trying to issue credentials that cannot be easily stolen, guessed, or imitated. This form of defense is about trying to tie credentials to a particular user in a way that makes them difficult to replicate or extract without physical access to that person. Authentication also presents a relatively rare opportunity for defenders to implement multiple overlapping lines of defense in the context of a computer system through multi-factor authentication. This means that an adversary wishing to take advantage of any of those capabilities must compromise all of the protected credentials, and in the uncertain environment of computer systems, where intruders are often able to replace one access path with another, and thereby simply bypass well-protected applications and devices, that is an unusual and valuable feature. This does not mean multi-factor authentication systems cannot be compromised. Mechanisms for compromising two-factor authentication schemes, which rely on both a password known to the user and a one-time code or notification transmitted by phone or other physical token, include compromising each of the victim's credentials individually and tricking victims into entering all of the credentials into forged or compromised authentication interfaces. FBI Special Agent Elliot Peterson describes one such scheme as implemented using the Game Over Zeus bot. gauze is sufficiently advanced that its operators can harvest both static and variable information in real time from the victims. Specifically, after the initiation of a man-in-the-middle attack, the gauze operators will be queried by the bank for the variable portion of the victim's two-factor initiation. The gauze operators pass this query on to the victim in the form of a fictitious web injection. While the victim thinks that the information is being sent to the bank, it is instead sent directly to the gauze operators. After stealing victims' personal information, the defendants use the stolen credentials to log into victims' bank accounts and to initiate fraudulent electronic funds transfers from the victims' banks. This approach calls into question the independence of multiple authentication credentials. If the credentials are all entered into a single interface, then it may not actually be necessary for adversaries to independently compromise each credential individually. This implies that one key component of protecting credentials is actually the protection of the authentication interface, not just the stored credentials themselves. That means increasing the work required to impersonate or compromise that interface and providing signals that help users verify the legitimacy of the interface demanding their credentials. Defending authentication credentials is complicated because, while the credentials themselves may be essential to intruders in some cases, there are a number of replaceable methods for obtaining them, and only some of those methods can be effectively controlled by the organization issuing the credentials. Those organizations can, generally, control how easily credentials can be guessed through the implementation of complexity requirements and internal attempts at guessing, as well as limits on how often users can enter incorrect guesses. But guessing is easier to protect against than imitation and interception because it provides signals of the attacker's work within the context of the protected system. That is, the very act of repeatedly guessing or entering an incorrect credential signals potentially malicious behavior. The work required to intercept or imitate an authentication credential does not necessarily provide any such signal to the authenticating organization, even if the work involved is considerable. For example, there was presumably a lot of work that went into decrypting the PIN numbers in the TJX breach perpetrated by Gonzalez, and also into crafting the targeted phishing emails sent by PLA Unit 61398 officers. But all of that work was invisible to TJX and the targets of the PLA's espionage efforts because it wasn't happening inside their networks. The behaviors that enable credential interception and imitation, as opposed to those that enable guessing, may not be behaviors that the issuing organizations are easily able to restrict or even detect. Multi-factor authentication is useful in part because it provides organizations with additional signals of suspicious activity even before an intruder has successfully authenticated using stolen credentials. The successful entry of one credential can be used to signal to the person to whom it was issued that authentication has been initiated using their credentials. For instance, if a user receives a one-time passcode via text message, that message functions both as a credential and a signal that someone is attempting to log into their account. Similarly, if additional authentication credentials are delivered via email or other applications, the receipt of those messages can serve as a signal in the event of attempted credential theft. Stolen credentials featured prominently in the TJX, South Carolina Department of Revenue, DigiNotar, PLA Unit 61398, OPM, and Sony incidents. But in all of those cases, only the SCDOR was especially singled out in the aftermath for failing to implement multi-factor authentication. This was perhaps because credential theft was the very first stage of that incident, and also because the costs of a two-factor authentication system seemed so low to many SCDOR critics. Recall State Senator Kevin Bryant's assertion at hearings on the incident that, "We wouldn't be here had somebody made that decision to use the multi-factor authentication." It is certainly true that multi-factor authentication can make it more difficult for intruders to steal credentials. It is also true, as the gauze interception tactic illustrates, that multi-factor authentication by no means makes it impossible for intruders to steal credentials. So the crucial question is not whether SCDOR could necessarily have prevented its breach by using multi-factor authentication, but rather whether it needed to be using multi-factor authentication in order to provide South Carolina's taxpayers with reasonable security for their data, and whether multi-factor authentication would on its own have been sufficient to meet that reasonableness standard. Along with multi-factor authentication, encryption is probably the security control that breached companies are most frequently lambasted for failing to use or for using incorrectly. As with multi-factor authentication, many firms would likely be more secure if they employed strong encryption to protect their data, but it would serve as no guarantee that intruders would be unable to access that data in plain text. Many companies need their employees and customers to be able to access and transmit sensitive information constantly in the course of conducting their normal business. That information can still be encrypted when it is stored on servers and sent over networks, but there needs to be some relatively cheap, fast means of decrypting it, usually by providing a set of trusted credentials. So, far from being a replacement for other types of security, the strength of an institution's encryption scheme is often highly dependent on the strength of its authentication system and credential protection. The reason Bryant cites the lack of multi-factor authentication as being responsible for the SCDOR breach, rather than the agency's lack of encryption, is probably because, once the intruders had stolen employee credentials, they might well have been able to decrypt filing information using those credentials, even if the data had been encrypted. In just this manner, the PLA Unit 61398 officers who infiltrated U.S. companies used stolen credentials to decrypt sensitive information stored in those companies' networks. One further challenge of relying on widespread encryption is that it can serve at cross purposes, with defenses intended to help monitor what is going on inside a particular organization's network. For instance, encryption might hinder attempts to monitor and restrict outbound traffic by making it more difficult for targeted firms to recognize attempts to exfiltrate sensitive information, and easier for adversaries to disguise such attempts, as happened in the DigiNotar incident, when the intruder used HTTPS encryption to hide his communication with the DigiNotar network. Network segmentation and data exfiltration. The central problem with focusing attention on one particular element of an organization's missing security in the aftermath of a breach, inadequately protecting credentials, for instance, or failing to filter phishing emails, or encrypting wireless networks poorly, or not encrypting sensitive data at all, is that none of these is absolutely essential to an intruder. There are ways of compromising computer systems without stealing credentials, as in the case of CryptoLocker, or without sending phishing emails, see DigiNotar and TJX, or without relying on organizations' failure to encrypt data, see TJX and Ashley Madison. These techniques are merely a means to some larger end for the intruder, whether that's stealing money or conducting espionage or taking revenge on the victim. From that perspective, these early technical stages of breaches are often interchangeable to their perpetrators. This framing, and by extension these stages of intrusions, lends itself to the traditional view of attackers having the advantage over defenders, because the former group only has to find one way to compromise a system, while the defenders have to block all possible attack pathways. But while capabilities such as sending phishing emails or connecting to unprotected wireless networks are not absolutely necessary for inflicting any particular type of harm, some computer capabilities are, in fact, essential. For instance, attackers' ability to send outbound traffic or exfiltrate data from compromised accounts and machines is a necessary prerequisite for stealing data. Often, so is the ability to traverse a target's networks by exploiting a toehold in one part of an organization's networks to access other portions of its computer systems. This was a crucial component of the TJX, SCDOR, DigiNotar, OPM, and Sony Pictures breaches, not being confined to a particular compromised device or user account, but instead being able to move laterally within each organization's networks to search for the information or resources of greatest interest to the intruders. The TJX and SCDOR breaches depended on the intruders being able to exfiltrate large volumes of payment card information from company servers. The PLA Unit 61398 espionage efforts and Sony Pictures breaches were similarly focused on retrieving sensitive information from the targeted systems, and the Spam House denial-of-service attacks and CryptoLocker dissemination required control of a bot, or the ability to send outbound traffic from thousands of machines. Financial fraud, espionage, and digital service disruption attacks all generally share this dependency on the capability to send outbound traffic from protected machines. Denial-of-service attacks could conceivably be perpetrated by an adversary who actually owned and operated thousands of computers, instead of using a bot comprised of other people's machines. But in practice, this is rare, and it would drive up the cost of initiating such an attack considerably. In some cases, this is a capability that application designers may be able to restrict. For instance, by flagging unusually high volumes of outgoing messages. But in many cases, it may be more effectively restricted by monitoring network connections and traffic rather than individual applications, implying a strong defensive role for the organizations that operate these networks. Similarly, those organizations are responsible for segmenting their networks so that a compromise of one account, application, or device does not easily grant intruders access to everything else stored in their computer systems. The risk of such segmentation efforts is that, especially for large organizations, they can become so complicated and extensive that it is difficult to confirm that they actually work as intended, as was the case with DigiNotar's sprawling set of firewall rules. Organizations have several tactics at their disposal to help distinguish between malicious and legitimate outbound activity, including monitoring the volume of traffic, its destination, and the repetition or regular patterns and timing with which it is sent. Restricting the volume of data that can be sent, or the ease with which it can be sent to unknown recipients, may increase the work required of adversaries to exfiltrate information. This can also be achieved by requiring extra layers of independent approval, or credentials, to send outbound traffic from a protected network, particularly in large volumes or to new recipients, separate from the credentials and restrictions placed on other capabilities. Restrictions placed on outbound traffic may also force attackers to do extra work that can in itself serve as an additional set of signals to organizations. For instance, if organizations use firewalls to restrict outbound connections to only certain servers, or allow outbound data to be sent in limited volumes, then activity that involves moving or copying information to those servers and compressing it or sending it at a steady, gradual rate may indicate malicious exfiltration. Forcing attackers to stage information in this manner before it can be successfully sent to an outside destination may provide organizations with useful signals of intended exfiltration even before it actually occurs. Viewed in this light, the role of defenses like firewalls is not just to prevent some forms of infiltration and exfiltration, but also to channel those behaviors through specific and identifiable paths that can then be monitored for signals of malicious activity. Outbound traffic can directly harm organizations that have failed to restrict it, as in the cases of Sony Pictures and SCDOR, but it can also harm other organizations that trust the compromised institution. Espionage incidents, for instance, often rely on exfiltrating sensitive information through an organization that is trusted by the victim, but has less stringent outbound traffic restrictions than the targeted institution itself. The perpetrators can then send the stolen data on from those third-party hop points to their own servers, which might otherwise trigger suspicion due to their location or ownership. PLA Unit 61398, for example, used computers at American universities as intermediaries for data exfiltration from targeted U.S. companies. In defending against unintended outbound traffic, organizations therefore protect not just themselves but also others from breaches. This makes outbound data flow restrictions all the more important, but also potentially diminishes the direct incentives that some institutions may have to implement such defenses. Limitations of individual organizations. There are many steps that companies and government agencies can take to protect their computer systems and sensitive data, but they can't do it alone. That's no excuse for negligence along the lines of Wyndham's decision to reject all security measures wholesale. But it is a reason to consider carefully the scope of what an organization reasonably can and cannot control when it comes to their computer security and where their incentives lie. Companies can exercise control over what information they store and how they store it. They can monitor and restrict what information leaves their networks and which programs are permitted to be installed on their systems. They can make rules about how many and what types of credentials are required to authenticate to their computer systems, and how easy it is for access to one component of those systems to be leveraged to access every other component and piece of information stored within. Configuring and managing all of those controls is difficult and important work, and it's largely something that firms have to figure out for themselves. That is true not just because there are so many different sets of guidelines and so little clear-cut concrete guidance from policymakers about what is required, but also because the appropriate settings and levels of security depend significantly on the particular features and functions of any individual entity and what it needs to be able to use its computer systems for. Accepting the wisdom of tailoring computer security to different workplaces and applications and users, and the wisdom of not imposing a rigid one-size-fits-all set of security requirements on everyone makes it that much harder to answer the question of when a breach should be blamed on the targeted organization and when it should be blamed exclusively on the perpetrator. Of course, breached firms argue that their misfortunes are always the fault of the perpetrators. In fact, Wyndham made exactly this point in its failed attempt to challenge the FTC's authority to deem their poor security an unfair business practice. Wyndham contended that a company does not treat its customers in an unfair manner when the business itself is victimized by criminals. But especially in an online context where relatively few perpetrators are likely to be both reliably identified and under the jurisdiction of the governments that may wish to charge them for their actions, simply casting blame on the perpetrators is not an effective strategy. In large part, that is why breached organizations instead turn their attention to blaming other stakeholders. It is why, in the aftermath of the TJX breach, the bitterest legal fights and largest financial settlements had less to do with Gonzalez and his co-conspirators than they did with the battles between TJX and the credit card companies and banks. It's why the South Carolina Department of Revenue was eager to throw NIST and the IRS under the bus when it came time to explain their security posture, and why Google publicly called out DigiNotar for being responsible for the compromise of Iranian Google accounts, and why OPM administrators blamed their predecessors, as well as third-party contractors, for the poor state of information security within the agency. What's striking about these disputes is not that organizations in hot water would try to blame someone else for their problems. What's striking is that often, when it comes to computer security, those organizations have a point. Yes, mistakes were made by the breached parties, and security controls were missing, but there were also potential defenders who could have stepped in to detect or stop certain stages of those breaches, even in some case, intermediaries who would have been better poised and equipped to tackle those stages than the breached organization itself. It may seem unfair to consider assigning some responsibility to those parties, and it's certainly not something existing liability regimes have encouraged. But sometimes these intermediaries have visibility into and control over more essential stages of cybersecurity incidents than the breached organizations do. In those cases, the question of who it is fair to blame for an incident may be less important, at least in terms of strengthening security for the future, than the question of who could most effectively prevent such an incident from recurring by cutting off perpetrators at a bottleneck stage of their attack. For instance, compromised accounts and devices at intermediary hotpoint organizations were used to run the gauze bot and distribute CryptoLocker, and to route information stolen by PLA Unit 61398 back to China. The fraudulent or misleading domains used to connect to OPM servers and steal data were purchased through web registrars. The open DNS resolvers used to bombard Spamhaus and Cloudflare with massive volumes of traffic were owned and operated by other organizations, and that traffic was delivered by Internet service providers. Regardless of whether they had any idea what their infrastructure and resources were being used for, all of those intermediary organizations had opportunities to intervene and protect the victims, and they largely failed to do so. They might well feel that there is no reason why they should be held responsible for the actions or mistakes of others, and for the most part, existing legal and policy frameworks have supported that logic. In the various legal battles and settlements that followed in the wake of these incidents, none of these intermediaries bore any of the costs of the breaches, providing little incentive for other organizations to take defensive measures that would protect their own devices and networks from being used as platforms to launch future intrusions. Instead, fights about liability have centered almost exclusively on trying to shift greater responsibility and costs onto the breached organizations themselves. But there are defensive roles that intermediary organizations can play that the breached ones simply cannot assume themselves. So, whether or not it seems fair or even reasonable to assign some responsibility to those third parties for security incidents, or to provide incentives for them to help protect others, it is essential for trying to cut off attackers at critical bottleneck stages of their intrusions. Breached organizations are often, and sometimes rightly, castigated for their poor security, but it is important to understand both what measures they could take that would have the greatest impact, and also the constraints and limitations they face when protecting their own computer systems. Managing encryption, augmenting authentication credentials, effective network segmentation, and carefully monitoring outbound traffic are all important defensive functions of organizations, whether companies or government agencies. The latter two controls, especially, can help cut off essential pathways for intruders attempting to carry out their ultimate aims. But since many of those ultimate aims play out beyond the context of an individual organization's computer systems, in financial transactions or development of new products using stolen intellectual property, or widespread publication of embarrassing information, for instance, there are many later stages of these incidents that these organizations are not well situated to detect or mitigate. Even when it comes to detecting suspicious widespread traffic patterns, individual organizations' ability to identify anomalous patterns, large-scale financial fraud, or malicious command and control servers is often inferior to the wider lens of payment networks who process huge volumes of transactions, or internet service providers who monitor much larger swaths of traffic. Meanwhile, security protocols for email and websites, the applications that perpetrators used to initiate access to the systems of DigiNotar, the PLA Unit 61398 espionage victims, OPM, Spamhaus, and Sony, are similarly beyond the control of individual organizations, though administrators can sometimes take steps to tailor those applications' use within their own networks. In order for all of these different stakeholders to play their respective roles in the defensive landscape, disputes over liability in the aftermath of security incidents ultimately need to become more complicated and involve more diverse stakeholders. For that to happen, however, there need to be clearer guidelines governing who is responsible for defending against which stages of cybersecurity incidents, so that both targeted organizations and all the other intermediaries surrounding and interacting with them online have some understanding of what is expected of them and how they fit into the larger security ecosystem. 13. Happy talk about good ideas. The role of policymakers in defending computer systems. The overarching lesson of the past decade is that learning from past security incidents entails defining liability regimes that clarify the defensive roles and responsibilities of all the different actors involved. And this is fundamentally a task for courts and policymakers. Computer security is by no means purely a policy problem. Application designers wield significant defensive power in determining how much work adversaries must do to attain certain capabilities. Organizations and their system administrators can tailor and augment those lines of defense by trying to make authentication credentials harder to steal and by restricting inbound and outbound network traffic. But these groups and others are limited in their ability to enact defenses that protect against the final stages of certain types of attacks, the stages that often extend beyond the context of their particular applications and networks, and involve the perpetrators getting what they are ultimately after, whether that's money, secrets, or revenge. Policymakers and law enforcement actors are better suited to some elements of mitigating the impacts of computer security incidents, particularly those related to addressing harm caused by third parties and curtailing criminals' ability to profit off their activity. Policymakers are particularly well poised to undertake these defensive roles because, unlike application designers and organizations, they are able to restrict and target not just the behavior of attackers, but also that of defenders, and all the stakeholders with the potential to play a defensive role. Policy has struggled to keep up with a field that's advancing rapidly, and cybersecurity policy is still at a fairly nascent stage in the United States and other countries. Most current policies focus fairly narrowly on the notification responsibilities owed to victims of data breaches, rather than on the responsibilities of anyone at any level to proactively defend against such breaches. Policy efforts that predate the TJX breach, such as the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, have largely failed to keep pace with the technical advances and geographic spread of attackers. Still, many governments have been fairly tentative when it comes to enacting cybersecurity policies, unsure of the most effective or appropriate actions to take in a space largely dominated by private firms, and choosing to rely heavily on voluntary programs and codes of conduct rather than more stringent requirements or laws. Many policymakers acknowledge that industry should play a leading role in securing private computer systems, but still argue for the importance of government intervention. The tension at the heart of these policy debates is how to let private firms take the lead when it comes to securing the information and computer networks that they own and operate, while still ensuring that governments provide them with the support and motivation to implement adequate security measures. Several governments are in the process of thinking through how to regulate these issues and have announced plans to implement new cybersecurity policies in the coming years. These policy efforts include regulations in China to ensure that data collected from Chinese citizens and companies is stored domestically, laws in the European Union to improve incident reporting, users' control over their personal data, and security standards for critical infrastructure, and proposals in the United States to increase penalties for breached companies and bolster the security of voting systems. At present, however, governments have relatively few models to work from or countries to point to as exemplars of how governments can successfully supplement private sector efforts to strengthen cybersecurity. The major security breaches of the past decade should play a prominent role in shaping these policy decisions. Only by thinking clearly about the battles to assign responsibility that follow these incidents and the coordination challenges of the different intermediary stakeholders involved, can policymakers hope to shape policies that prepare and incentivize private and public institutions to defend against future breaches and their social, financial, and political consequences.